They say history remembers what it's proud of and buries what it fears. But what happens when a story is erased, not because it was evil, but because it was unexplainable? 1847, somewhere along the banks of the Mississippi, a child was born who should never have existed, pale as bone, eyes like wet glass, skin that burned under daylight. His name was whispered only once in ledgers before being crossed out: Samuel. For years, no master would claim him. No plantation would take him in. Even other slaves refused to touch him, until one woman, a widow with more secrets than servants, paid for him in silver and silence. They said she was a savior. But what if she wasn't? What if what she took him in for was something worse? The humid breath of Louisiana in 1847 was thick enough to drown a man. Even before dawn, the air pressed down heavy and wet, making the cane fields shimmer like they were sweating. The sun hadn't yet risen, but the mosquitoes already had, humming in swarms over the muddy banks of the Mississippi River. The scent of rot, sweat, and molasses hung together, an invisible fog that defined the lives of everyone trapped on the Whitmore. Kavanaugh and Hensley plantations stretched along the river bend. The South was booming, its riches drawn from sugar and human misery, and Louisiana's soil was its cursed treasure chest. The overseers bragged that a single acre could feed a city if only the slaves worked hard enough. The owners never said whose bones were crushed beneath that soil to make it fertile. It was in this place, during one of the cruelest summers the region had seen, that a woman named Maria went into labor in a one-room slave cabin. The air inside was suffocating, and the screams of birth were half muffled by the rustle of cane stalks outside. The midwife, a tired woman with hands cracked from field work, did what she could. She had delivered many babies under worse circumstances, but this one was different. The child didn't cry at first. When he did, the sound came out thin and strange, almost like the wail of a cat caught in a storm. The midwife nearly dropped him when she saw his skin, pale as bone, the color of clouds before a thunderhead. His hair was white, his lashes near invisible, and when his eyes opened, they reflected the lantern light in a way that made everyone in the room freeze. The women whispered prayers under their breath. One crossed herself. Another spat on the dirt floor to ward off the devil. Maria didn't understand what she had done wrong. She begged them not to take him away, but before she could even hold her son, the door burst open. The overseer, a red-faced man named Claiborne, had heard the rumors spreading through the quarters. He wanted to see it for himself, the ghost baby. He yanked the child from the midwife's arms and held him up in the lamplight. For a moment, even he looked unsure. The boy's features were unmistakably African, but his skin was so white it seemed translucent. Veins traced blue lines beneath it. His lips were pale, his eyes an icy gray. Clay's mouth twisted in disgust. "That ain't no child," he said. "That's a curse." The next morning, word spread through the plantation like sickness. The master refused to have the boy baptized, saying no preacher would touch him. The slaves whispered that the boy's soul was caught between worlds, too white for heaven, too black for salvation. Maria was forced back to the fields 2 weeks after giving birth, and the child was left to be raised by whoever would feed him. Most refused. They said his stare made the chickens stop laying eggs, that his presence turned milk sour. They named him Samuel, though no one used the name aloud. The older children called him Ghost Boy. He grew thin and quiet. By the time he could walk, he had learned to avoid the sun, hiding under porches or inside barrels. His skin burned red at the slightest touch of light. When other children played, he watched from the shadows. When he tried to join, they threw dirt at him, shouting that his mother had lain with the devil. Even the overseers avoided him, saying he gave them chills. At night, Maria sang to him through the cracks in the slave quarters, her voice trembling with guilt and love. She wanted to believe God had a reason for making him different. But in that place and time, difference was another word for doomed. In 1849, the plantation changed hands. The new owner, a man named Hollis Granger, wanted no unnatural children on his land. Samuel was sold at $10, less than the price of a mule, and sent downriver with a group of unsold slaves. No one wanted him. Every master who saw him hesitated. Some thought he was diseased, others feared the wrath of God for keeping him. At one auction, the auctioneer tried to smear ash on his face to darken his skin, but when the sun caught him, the truth bled through. The crowd recoiled. He was called the cursed albino, and when no one bid, he was left chained to the post overnight. The next morning, someone had written in chalk on the wall behind him, "Not fit for this world." Years passed like that. Samuel drifted from one plantation to another, each time lasting only weeks before being sent away. Some owners tried to use him as a house servant, but guests complained. One woman fainted when she saw him in candlelight, saying he looked like a corpse that had learned to walk. He slept in barns, ate from scraps, and learned not to speak unless spoken to. He didn't even know his age anymore. The only constant in his life was the river, the Mississippi that wound through everything, silent and endless, carrying secrets from one shore to another. It was near that river, in 1851, that a story began spreading among the traders in New Orleans. A wealthy widow from Baton Rouge was seeking a particular kind of servant. No one knew what she wanted, only that she paid in silver and never haggled. Her name was Eleanor Whitlock. Her husband had died the previous year, leaving her the plantation, its debts, and a reputation tangled in whispers. She was known to keep odd company: scientists, theologians, foreign doctors. Her mansion was filled with books in languages no one could read, and she was said to hold seances in her parlor. Some called her brilliant, others called her mad. When Eleanor appeared at the auction that spring, the traders fell silent. She was dressed entirely in black, her face veiled though the day was hot. Her voice, soft and deliberate, carried the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She inspected the line of slaves without interest until her eyes found Samuel. She stopped walking. The boy kept his gaze low, expecting ridicule. But instead of revulsion, there was curiosity in her voice. "Does he burn in sunlight?" she asked. The trader stammered, unsure how to answer. "A bit, ma'am. But he's strong enough for work." Eleanor nodded. "Not for work," she said quietly. "For study." She offered 3 times the asking price and demanded that no record of the sale include his name. When the trader hesitated, she slipped an envelope of money into his hand. The next day, the ledger listed an unnamed servant child, purchased by E. Whitlock. That was the moment the boy no one wanted became the property of the woman no one understood. The carriage that carried them back to the Whitlock estate rolled through miles of marshland, past dead trees and fields of cane waving like thin, desperate arms. Inside, Samuel sat opposite Eleanor. She studied him as though he were a painting that might change if she stared long enough. "Do you know why I bought you?" she asked. Samuel shook his head. "Because you are what they fear," she whispered. "And fear is only another form of ignorance. I mean to understand it," he didn't reply. The rhythm of the carriage wheels filled the silence. To him, she was just another master, another pair of eyes that saw him as something less than human. Yet in her gaze, there was something he couldn't name. It wasn't kindness. It was hunger, not for power, but for revelation, the kind that drives people to ruin. By the time the carriage reached the plantation gates, night had fallen. The manor loomed ahead, lit by a single lantern in the upper window. The wind carried the scent of magnolia and decay. Samuel stepped out and looked up. He didn't know then that he would never again see the outside world freely. For in 1847, Louisiana, where men traded flesh as wealth and faith as justification, a boy born too pale for his people had already become a mystery worth owning. Samuel's life under Eleanor Whitlock began in a silence so deep it felt like another kind of imprisonment. The Whitlock plantation was not like the others he had known. It was vast, yes, but it was empty, eerily so. The cane fields were overgrown, the stables half abandoned, the workyards quiet except for the crows that circled above. Only a handful of servants remained, all of them older, all of them too frightened or too loyal to leave. The mansion itself was a decaying monument to its former wealth. Tall windows shuttered from light, staircases creaking like they carried ghosts, corridors lined with portraits whose eyes followed anyone who passed. When Samuel first entered, Eleanor did not show him to a slave's quarters. She led him up the grand staircase to a small attic room with a single narrow window. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched in charcoal, drawn into the wood as though someone had tried to trap something invisible there. The boy touched one of them and felt the faint grain of ash beneath his fingers. Eleanor watched him quietly. "You'll stay here," she said. "You'll be safe from the sun." She left without locking the door, but Samuel did not try to leave. He had learned that freedom often hid cruelty beneath it. Days passed in a haze of silence and shadow. Food appeared outside his room. Bread, soup, fruit when it was in season, but no one spoke to him. At night he could hear Eleanor moving through the house below. Sometimes she whispered to herself. Sometimes she wept. And sometimes faintly, he heard her reading aloud in a language he didn't know, her voice rising and falling like a prayer. The servants avoided his eyes. One of them, an older woman named Clara, was the only one who ever spoke to him. "Don't look in the mirrors," she told him once, her hands trembling as she set down a tray of food. "If you do, you'll see what she sees." Samuel didn't understand what she meant, but the warning settled deep inside him. There were mirrors everywhere in the house, some covered with sheets, others cracked or turned to face the walls. It was as though Eleanor feared reflections but couldn't bear to destroy them. Weeks became months. Samuel learned to move quietly, to listen rather than speak. He began to notice the small things that others ignored. How the air changed when Eleanor entered a room. How the candle flames flickered when she was near. How her gaze lingered not on faces but on skin, as if searching for something beneath it. She kept notebooks filled with sketches and lines of script. Once, when she left one open, he caught a glimpse of a drawing that looked disturbingly familiar. A boy's figure outlined in white ink, surrounded by rays of light that pierced his body like needles. Eleanor treated him differently from any master he had known. She did not beat him, nor did she force him into labor. Instead, she observed him, asked him questions he could not answer. "Do you dream, Samuel?" she asked one evening, as they sat in the dim light of her study. "Do you see things when you close your eyes?" He shook his head. "Do you feel pain when the light touches you?" He hesitated, then nodded. She leaned forward, eyes gleaming behind the thin veil she often wore indoors. "That's not pain," she whispered. "That's the body rejecting what it cannot contain." Her fascination grew by the day. She examined his eyes under candlelight, traced his veins with gloved fingers, took small samples of his hair and blood, all while murmuring that she was seeking the line between flesh and spirit. Samuel didn't understand her words, but he could feel the unease thickening in the house. The servants began to leave one by one. Some said they heard footsteps when no one was there. Others claimed they saw light glowing beneath the attic door at night, bright enough to burn through the cracks. One night, Clara came to him again. Her voice was shaking. "You need to pray, child," she said. "That woman ain't looking to save your soul. She's trying to take it." Samuel tried to ask her what she meant, but she turned and fled down the stairs, clutching a rosary so tight the beads cracked in her hand. Later that same week, Samuel woke to find Eleanor standing beside his bed. She was holding a lantern, her face pale and hollow, her hair loose around her shoulders. "You shouldn't hide from the light," she said softly. "It's what you're made of." Before he could answer, she placed the lantern close to his skin. The heat stung. He winced and pulled away, but she didn't move. "Do you see it?" she whispered. "It doesn't burn you, it reveals you." She touched his cheek, and her fingers trembled. "I was right. You are not a mistake. You're proof." From that night onward, she kept him closer. She made him sit in her study while she wrote, sometimes for hours, sometimes until dawn. She asked about his mother, about the day he was born, about any signs or visions she might have seen. Samuel remembered only the stories other slaves told him, that he was cursed, that his skin was a warning. When he told Eleanor, she smiled faintly. "They fear what they can't name," she said. "But I can name it. I can give it purpose." She began to call him my angel. The word frightened him. He didn't know what angels were supposed to look like, but he'd seen the drawings in her books, figures with wings, radiant and cruel. Sometimes she spoke to him as if he weren't human at all, telling him that his blood carried something pure, something untarnished by sin. Other times she collapsed into sobs, begging him to forgive her, to save her from her own darkness. He didn't know what she had done, but he knew the house was filled with it, the kind of quiet guilt that seeps into walls. Rumors spread beyond the plantation. Neighbors whispered that Eleanor was dabbling in forbidden science, that she had gone mad from grief and isolation. Some claimed she had taken in a ghost child. Others said she was trying to raise the dead. The local preacher visited once, but after only an hour inside the mansion, he left pale and silent. He never returned. By the end of that year, the plantation's crops began to fail. The soil grew thin and dry. Workers fell ill. The few remaining slaves muttered that the land was cursed because of the boy and the mistress who kept him. Samuel felt the stares of hatred even when he stayed hidden inside. He wanted to leave, but Eleanor watched him constantly now, as though afraid he might vanish. She told him that people outside wouldn't understand what he was, that they would kill him for what they couldn't comprehend. But here, she said, you can become what you were meant to be. Every night she made him kneel before a mirror and repeat verses after her. Sometimes they were prayers, sometimes incantations. He didn't understand the words, only that they made the air feel thick, that they made the candles burn blue. The more he repeated them, the more Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, of awe or terror he couldn't tell. "You see," she said one night, her voice trembling with feverish joy, "you been light itself. You are living proof that God's creation is unfinished." It was the first time Samuel realized she wasn't studying him to understand, she was trying to change him. He began to dream of his mother, of the river, of sunlight he couldn't touch. He began to sense that something was wrong in the way the house breathed, in the way Eleanor's shadow sometimes moved before she did. And though he couldn't name it, he knew that whatever she saw when she looked at him was not a boy at all, but a reflection of something she had lost, or something she hoped to create again. Each morning the light in the house seemed weaker, as if the walls themselves were dimming. The air carried the scent of burning candles and iron. Samuel's skin grew thinner. Even the smallest cut shimmered faintly before it bled. Eleanor called it transformation. The servants who remained called it witchcraft. And deep within that crumbling house, between her obsession and his fear, something unseen began to stir, a force that neither mercy nor cruelty could contain. The Whitlock plantation had always been a place of contradiction, wealth and ruin, beauty and decay. It was the kind of house that seemed alive, its walls breathing softly, its doors groaning like they remembered things better left forgotten. But after Eleanor brought Samuel there, the air itself began to change. Servants said the nights grew heavier, the temperature colder, and the silence sharper, as if the house were holding its breath. The boy who should have been invisible became the center of everything, a reminder of how far from reason people could drift when fear and curiosity entwined. In the South of 1851, whiteness was power, blackness was bondage, and anything in between was forbidden. The very idea of Samuel's existence threatened that order. He did not fit the world's simple design. To the men who ruled by color, he was a riddle that defied their faith. To the slaves, he was an omen that mocked their suffering. No one knew what to do with a child whose skin was white but whose blood in their eyes was not. In a place where every human being was measured by shade, he was the color of confusion. Eleanor understood this. She studied Samuel not only as a specimen, but as a symbol, something that defied the categories that justified the cruelty around her. For years, she had lived as a woman both privileged and imprisoned by her position. Her husband's wealth had bought her comfort but not freedom. Even before his death, she was whispered about in church circles, a woman who read forbidden books, who entertained abolitionists under the guise of intellectual salons, who dared to question the divine order of race and class. But she had been clever, quiet, careful, until Samuel arrived. Her servants said she spent hours alone with him in the library, reading aloud from scientific journals and theological tracts. She spoke of the color of the soul, of the purity of light. Her fascination wasn't only scientific, it was spiritual. She saw in him a paradox that could unravel everything she'd been taught to believe. If he was both slave and white, both pure and condemned, then the world's cruel hierarchy was nothing more than an illusion. But Eleanor's mind was not one of quiet reason. Her obsession was not liberation, it was conquest of mystery itself. She did not want to destroy the system that birthed Samuel's suffering. She wanted to transcend it, to claim understanding of it, even if it meant destroying him in the process. Rumors of her behavior spread through the parish. Some said she was trying to bleach the soul from sin. Others whispered that she believed Samuel was the next stage of humanity, an uncorrupted vessel. Whatever her true belief, it blurred the line between science and superstition. She corresponded with a small circle of thinkers in Europe who spoke of natural philosophy, the early language of what would later become genetics. They believed blood carried not just life, but divinity and defect, that through study one could isolate the essence of purity itself. To Eleanor, Samuel was living evidence of that theory, a body that mirrored both whiteness and otherness. Proof that perhaps purity was not about race at all, but something else, something luminous that existed beyond human definition. To the people on the plantation, however, there was nothing divine about him. They saw only the curse. The slaves avoided the main house, claiming that the air near it hummed at night like distant thunder. They said the boy's shadow didn't fall right, that when he passed by in the moonlight, he looked like a figure cut out of mist. They told stories of animals refusing to eat near his room, of birds falling silent when he stepped outside. It wasn't just fear of Eleanor's wrath that kept them quiet. It was superstition older than the country itself. For the slaves, the world was full of signs, omens that warned of spirits walking among men. To them, Samuel was such a sign. He was born of darkness, yet carried the skin of light. It made no sense, and what people cannot explain, they often choose to hate. In the quarters, they whispered that he was the offspring of some celestial punishment, that God had sent him as a reminder that no one escaped the sin of slavery clean. Even Mariah, his mother, who still lived on another plantation, had stopped speaking of him. Some said she refused to believe he was alive. Eleanor ignored all of it. She fed Samuel well, clothed him in fine linen, and treated him like a guest instead of property. But her kindness was not love. It was an experiment in control. She kept meticulous notes of his reactions to light, his sensitivity to touch, even the pitch of his voice when he spoke. At times she brought visitors, doctors, priests, men of science, who examined the boy and argued among themselves whether he was diseased or divine. One doctor declared albinism a spiritual deformity, a punishment for sins of the parents. Another called it a blessing, evidence that the blood of angels could still run through man. Samuel listened without understanding. He had no language for what they debated. He only knew he was being watched. Every word about him was spoken as though he wasn't there. He tried to please Eleanor, to earn her smiles, to avoid her moods, but every kindness she gave came wrapped in strange rituals. Sometimes she made him kneel before a basin of water and stare at his reflection until he trembled. Sometimes she whispered hymns while tracing the veins on his wrist. Each act made him feel less human, more like an object of worship and disgust. What Eleanor failed to see was that her fascination was its own form of violence. By naming him Miracle, she stripped him of personhood as surely as the overseers had. She believed she was elevating him beyond color, beyond class, beyond human cruelty, but in truth, she was trapping him in a cage made of her own obsession. She had turned his difference into doctrine, his pain into revelation. As her experiments deepened, she began keeping the boy indoors at all times. The windows of his room were covered with thick black cloth to protect his skin, but he longed for sunlight nonetheless. He dreamed of warmth, though it hurt him. Sometimes, when Eleanor slept, he would creep down the hallway and touch the door handle that led outside, feeling the faintest breeze beneath it, the smell of rain and cane fields beyond. It was the only reminder he had that a world still existed past the walls of the mansion. The social tension outside those walls was tightening too. Across Louisiana, whispers of rebellion moved through the slave quarters. The decade before the Civil War was thick with unrest. Yet even amid that chaos, no rumor spread faster than the one about the white-skinned slave kept by the widow Whitlock. Traders in New Orleans told the story like a ghost tale. Some claimed she was breeding a new race. Others swore she'd gone mad, trying to turn a slave into a saint. Whatever the version, they all ended the same way, with a warning to stay away from that cursed house by the river. The paradox of Samuel's existence haunted both worlds. To the black slaves, he was a walking insult, a symbol of how far whiteness reached even into their suffering. To the white masters, he was blasphemy, proof that God could blur the boundaries they claimed divine. And to Eleanor, he was something else entirely, the key to a secret she could not name. She wrote in her journal that light lives where truth hides. She believed Samuel's skin, so pale it glowed, was not a deformity, but evidence that light itself could be trapped in flesh, that God had written his mysteries into the body of a child and left her to decipher them. In her desperation to prove this, she crossed lines she could never return from. Her servants began to find jars of preserved specimens in the cellar, blood, skin, something like ash labeled with dates. She spent hours in the chapel whispering to the altar, her voice breaking into laughter or sobs. And always she returned to Samuel, staring at him with eyes that saw not a boy but a divine equation. In 1851 Louisiana, the concept of purity was both idol and weapon. It was used to justify ownership, violence, entire hierarchies of cruelty. Samuel, in his fragile, luminous body, was living proof that purity was not power, it was isolation. He carried both the oppressor's skin and the oppressed's blood, and for that, the world wanted to erase him. Eleanor wanted to preserve him, but only as something holy, not human. And in that twisted reverence lay the darkest truth of all, that sometimes the most terrifying monsters of history were not born out of hatred, but out of the blind, desperate search for meaning. By the winter of 1823, the plantation was silent in ways that unsettled even the seasoned overseers. Snow rarely touched the soil of the Carolinas, but frost crept across the edges of the fields that season, sharp silver lines glistening on the barren cotton stalks. It was as if the land itself held its breath, waiting. The boy, once mocked and shunned, now lived under the roof of the very woman who had bought him when no one else would. To the other slaves, it seemed almost supernatural. A woman of wealth and status taking in a child whom everyone else believed cursed. There was talk of witchcraft, of debts to dark spirits, of bargains sealed in blood. Yet no one dared to speak too loudly, for the woman's reach was long and her reputation unpredictable. Her name was Lady Miriam Wainwright. Widowed, childless, and isolated in her massive estate, she had built her fortune through ruthless dealings. She owned people the way others owned horses, yet there was something in her that defied simple cruelty. When she brought the albino boy to her home, she renamed him Silas. Not a slave name, not quite a Christian one either, something in between. "You will not work the fields," she said to him that first night, her voice low and trembling with something unspoken. "You will learn to read. You will learn to listen." And so he did. For the first time, Silas slept on clean sheets. He ate from proper plates. But comfort did not bring peace. At night he could hear whispers through the walls, voices not belonging to servants or masters. The old mansion creaked like something alive, its walls shifting with memory. The wind carried sounds that seemed to form words, sometimes calling his name, sometimes repeating his mother's final cries. He told Miriam of this once hesitantly. She only smiled, her pale lips curving faintly. "Some houses remember," she said. "Ours remembers more than most." Miriam took a strange liking to him, showing him books about anatomy, phrenology, and strange sciences that most plantation owners would have called blasphemy. She spoke to him not as a child, but as a vessel, as if he were something meant to absorb the knowledge she poured into him. She'd make him repeat passages, trace diagrams of the human skull, measure his own head with brass calipers, and record the numbers in a small, leather-bound book. At first he thought it was simply a form of education, but in time he noticed she only ever compared his measurements, never her own. Outside, the slaves began to fear him more than they pitied him. They said his pale skin glowed in the moonlight, that the woman had used his blood to ward off death. They whispered that Lady Miriam had lost her own infant to fever years ago, and that she believed this boy, this ghost-skinned child, was her second chance at motherhood. But others believed something darker, that she thought his body, so unlike the others, held the secret to reversing decay, that his strange coloring was a mark of divine experiment. Rumors began to circulate among nearby estates, quiet gossip shared between wives during tea and hushed talk among the help. "The widow has lost her mind," they'd say. "She keeps a ghost in her house." Even the preacher avoided her land after sundown, claiming his horse would not cross the gates without trembling. Silas, meanwhile, grew more withdrawn. The books Miriam gave him filled his nights, but one day he stumbled upon one she had not meant him to find. It was kept behind a locked drawer, bound in black leather, filled with pages written not in English, but in a strange code of symbols. Drawings of human figures, diagrams of nerves, and sketches of eyes that looked like his. The words beneath were written in ink so faded it seemed older than the paper itself. When he asked her about it, she didn't scold him. She only whispered, "You were meant to find it. Now you will understand why they feared you." That night the storm came. Thunder rolled over the flatlands and the mansion's candles trembled in their holders. Miriam led Silas into the cellar. a room he had never seen before. The air was cold and metallic, the smell of salt and copper filling his lungs. There, beneath the house, were stone tables, glass jars, and tools that gleamed under candlelight. He saw names etched into the walls, not carved, but burned into the stone. The names of slaves long dead, their marks faintly glowing under the flicker of flame. "Do you hear them?" she asked him. "They still linger. But you are something new." Silas wanted to run, but his feet refused to move. Miriam stepped closer, her face almost tender. "I studied you before I bought you," she said. "Do you think I didn't know? The fever that took your mother, it wasn't a fever. It was a curse of blood, a rare inheritance. I saw it in the records of your line. They called your ancestors moonborn. They were taken from West Africa centuries ago, brought here because their skin was pale as salt. But no one knew why they lived so long. Some said they were immune to disease. Others said their hearts never fully died. The cellar grew colder. The wind howled through cracks in the stone, carrying faint human sounds, wails, whispers, pleading breaths. Miriam held up the book, her fingers trembling. "Your blood is different, Silas. I can feel it. When they whipped you, when they starved you, and yet you did not break. You are not like them. You are not like us." Her voice cracked. "You are the bridge." He could barely breathe. His heartbeat echoed in the dark, too loud, too fast. He wanted to scream, to deny her words, but some part of him, a part buried deep in nightmares, believed her. Because he had felt it too. He had seen scars close overnight. He had watched bruises vanish. He had felt a coldness in his veins that never truly warmed. By dawn, the storm had passed, but the house was never the same. The servants refused to enter the cellar again. Miriam stopped attending church, and Silas began to see faces in the mirrors, reflections that didn't match his movements, smiles that came too late. He started dreaming of ships, of chains beneath moonlight, of a whispering woman in the waves saying, "It was never meant for them to have you." In the months that followed, visitors to the Wainwright estate dwindled. The boy who had once been unwanted now walked the halls like a secret she guarded with her life. Yet one night, when the doctor from Charleston came to deliver supplies, he claimed he saw the woman kneeling beside the boy, her hands bloodied, whispering Latin into his ear. The doctor never returned. When spring came again, Lady Miriam vanished. Her servant said she left for the coast and never came back. Only Silas remained, standing on the porch at sunrise, pale against the red sky, silent, watching the fields as if waiting for something older than time itself to rise from the soil once more. Years passed, but time never seemed to move the same way inside the Wainwright estate. Seasons changed beyond its iron gates, yet within its halls, everything felt trapped, as if frozen between the breath of the living and the silence of the dead. Silas had grown taller now, lean and graceful, though his pallor remained untouched by the sun. His eyes, once wide with fear, now carried the strange calm of someone who had seen too much. To the few who dared pass the road by the mansion, he looked almost ageless, not boy, not man, but something that belonged to neither world. The town around the estate had changed as well. Rumors had taken root like weeds. The story of the ghost widow and her pale ward had become a local legend, whispered to children to keep them from wandering near the swamps. But to those who remembered the Wainwright name, the tale was darker. Some said the woman had been taken by the devil she served. Others claimed her spirit still walked the halls, teaching the boy her forbidden knowledge. No one went near the estate after sunset. The church refused to bury anyone with ties to the household, and yet strange lights could often be seen through the windows at night, flickering, fading, pulsing like a heartbeat. Silas spent his days in silence. The servants had long since fled, leaving him alone among the decaying furniture and dust-choked books. But he was not entirely alone. The voices had returned, softer now, more patient, as though waiting for him to listen. Sometimes they came from the walls, other times from the mirrors. They whispered his name, the name she had given him, and something more. A name that wasn't his, but seemed to belong to him just the same. He continued Miriam's studies. The black leather journal, the one filled with symbols and strange anatomy, had become his obsession. At first, the markings made no sense, but with time, he began to see patterns. The drawings were not random. They were a language of blood and geometry. mapping not just the human body but something deeper, the link between flesh and spirit. Some pages described the moonborn line, a lineage that traced back centuries to tribes who worshipped the moon as a living being. They believed certain children, born with skin as pale as milk, were chosen, not by gods but by something older. They were meant to serve as vessels between the world of breath and the world of echoes. Silas began to question if this was what Miriam had seen in him all along. Not a boy to be pitied, but a key to something vast and buried. He could feel it sometimes. That pull beneath his skin, like tides responding to an unseen force. When he cut himself once by accident, the wound sealed within hours. He no longer felt hunger the way others did. And at night, when he dreamed, he saw faces he didn't recognize but somehow remembered. Chained men singing under a ghostly moon. Women stirring bowls of blood. Children whispering to bones buried beneath trees. One autumn night, as fog rolled across the plantation, he heard footsteps outside. For the first time in years, someone had come. A man in a black coat carrying a lantern called his name. He said he was a scholar from Virginia, sent by the Historical Society to study the Wainwright records. "They say you are the last of them," the man said, stepping closer to the gate. His voice trembled slightly, though he tried to sound calm. "I've come to understand what really happened here." Silas didn't answer right away. He simply watched the man's breath fog in the cold air. Finally, he said, "If you walk past that gate, you won't be the same when you leave." The scholar hesitated, but curiosity won. Inside, the mansion smelled of damp wood and dust. His lantern light caught on portraits, their eyes following him through the halls. He asked about Lady Miriam, about her research, about her disappearance, but Silas only led him to the cellar. There, everything remained as it had been the night she vanished, the stone tables, the jars, the names scorched into the walls. "She was looking for immortality," the scholar said quietly. "They all were in their way." "But what did she find in you?" Silas turned to him, his expression unreadable. "She didn't find it," he said. "She became it." The man frowned, unsure if it was metaphor or madness. But then he noticed the faint pulse of light coming from beneath the floorboards. He knelt down, brushing away dust, revealing thin cracks that glowed faintly blue-white. "What is that?" he whispered. Silas didn't move. "The house remembers." Before the scholar could respond, the light flared. The sound of wind rushed through the cellar, though the air was still. For a moment, the man thought he heard voices. 1,000 whispers layered into one, crying, singing, warning. He dropped his lantern, and in the brief burst of darkness, he felt a hand brush his shoulder. Cold, gentle, but inhumanly strong. When the flame returned, Silas stood closer than before, his eyes bright with reflection. "You came here to understand her," Silas said, "but she was only the beginning. There are others. There always have been. The ones they took, the ones they silenced. They carried this same mark. And every century one returns to remind the world." The scholar backed away, heart pounding. "You're saying you. I'm saying I remember everything she taught me," Silas interrupted. "And everything she tried to forget." When the scholar finally fled the house, he swore the boy, no, the man, hadn't followed. But as he reached the road, he looked back once and saw Silas standing in the window, watching him. The reflection of the lantern light caught his skin in such a way that it glowed faintly blue, the same light that had come from the floor. The scholar left the region by dawn and never spoke publicly of what he saw, but his private notes, later discovered in an attic in Richmond, described a figure untouched by time, living in the ruins of a house that refused to die. Years turned to decades. The estate decayed further, swallowed by vines and soil, but locals claimed they still saw a pale figure walking the grounds on moonless nights. Some said he was cursed to remain until Miriam returned. Others believed he had become the guardian of her secret, the last vessel of a knowledge mankind was never meant to possess. When surveyors came in the 1890s to map the area for a new railway, they reported that no house stood where the Wainwright property was said to be. Only empty land covered in fog and ash. Yet one of them, before leaving, found a small black book buried at the edge of the field. Inside were pages of symbols and a single line written in faded ink. "The moonborn do not die. They simply remember." By the turn of the century, the Wainwright legend had almost faded into the background noise of Southern folklore. just another ghost story whispered to travelers passing through the low country. But history has a way of waiting, and what people forget, the earth remembers. In 1906, when construction crews began clearing the land near the old Wainwright property for a new cotton mill, they found something buried beneath the roots of an ancient oak. It wasn't a grave in the traditional sense, no coffin, no cross, just a hollowed chamber lined with stones, carved with the same moon-like symbols that no one could read. Inside lay the remains of a woman's dress, still faintly smelling of lavender despite the years, and beside it, a single lock of pale white hair. The local paper printed it as a curiosity, calling it "The Ghost of the Widow Returns," but those who dug the site claimed they'd seen something else. When they unearthed the chamber, the air had shifted, not like a breeze, but like the room itself had breathed. And one worker, a young man from Charleston, swore he saw footprints in the soil that hadn't been there a moment before. They led away from the pit and vanished into the fog beyond the trees. No one stayed past dusk after that. Weeks later, strange things began to happen in the nearby town. Livestock were found dead, their bodies untouched but eyes clouded white as if drained of color. A preacher claimed he saw a pale figure standing in the churchyard at night, watching from the shadows, its face hidden but its presence unmistakable. The locals called it the Moonborn Curse. They said the boy, Silas, had returned, still searching for the woman who made him, or for something buried deeper than her. Not long after, a journalist from New Orleans arrived, eager to expose the story as superstition. His name was Edwin LaRue, a skeptic with a reputation for dismantling ghost stories and church miracles alike. He traveled to the ruins of the Wainwright estate, noting in his journal that the ground felt unnaturally soft, as if the earth had been disturbed too recently for a place abandoned so long. He spent his first night in what remained of the house, just a few walls and the skeletal frame of the great staircase, and described hearing faint music somewhere below him. It was not melody, he wrote, but rhythm, slow, deliberate, and almost like a heartbeat. The next day he discovered the cellar entrance, half buried in mud. Inside he found stone walls carved with markings identical to those from the burial site. He also found jars, shattered and empty, and long tables stained with something darker than rust. In his notes, he speculated it might have been part of early medical experiments, perhaps even tied to Miriam Wainwright's obsession with anatomy and spiritualism. But there was one thing he couldn't explain, the faint blue luminescence that seemed to pulse from cracks in the floor, even when his lantern went out. He stayed 3 nights, each one more restless than the last. On the 3rd night, he wrote that he felt a presence, deliberate and intelligent, moving in the dark. His final journal entry read, "She isn't gone. She never was. The child walks the boundary. I've seen his shadow where no light falls." Edwin LaRue was found the next morning by local farmers, collapsed on the roadside 3 miles from the estate. His eyes were open but clouded, milky white like those of the dead cattle. The coroner listed his cause of death as heart failure induced by terror. His notebook was confiscated by the sheriff and later disappeared from the archives. For decades, no one spoke of the Wainwright name again. But in 1932, a historian from Columbia stumbled upon a strange correspondence in an old university library. A series of letters between Lady Miriam and a man identified only as Dr. O. The letters described early experiments on blood regeneration, the blending of human vitality and lunar cycles, and an entity referred to as the vessel of reversal. One letter, written just months before her disappearance, read, "The child's blood holds beyond what nature allows. He heals where he should die. I believe he may never die at all." The old tribes were right. They called him the Pale Bridge. The historian published an article about it, a dry academic piece, but the public response was explosive. Spiritualists claimed proof of immortality. The church called it blasphemy. Paranormal investigators flooded the Carolinas, all hoping to find traces of the Moonborn line. Some claimed to see a figure near the ruins. Others heard voices in the wind calling the name Silas. Even government men came once. Dark cars, polished shoes, though no report was ever filed. In 1954, a photograph surfaced. Taken by a hiker near the marsh, it showed what appeared to be a man standing among the reeds, staring directly at the camera. His features were faint, blurred by mist, but his skin gleamed pale in the moonlight. Experts dismissed it as exposure trickery, but those who lived near the old land recognized the stance, the stillness. They said it was the boy. He hadn't aged. By the late 20th century, the legend had evolved again. Now it wasn't just a ghost story. It had become a warning. Parents told their children never to walk the fields on moonless nights, and fishermen swore that sometimes, when the tide was low, they could hear chanting beneath the water, rhythmic, inhuman, echoing the same heartbeat LaRue had described decades before. The old oak under which Miriam's dress was found eventually fell, split by lightning, but those who cut the wood said it bled sap the color of milk. Then, in 1989, during Hurricane Hugo, something impossible happened. The storm's path should have erased every remnant of the plantation. Yet when aerial photos were taken afterward, the outline of the old mansion could be seen clearly in the flattened trees, like a shadow burned into the earth. No structure stood there, yet the shape was unmistakable. The Wainwright house, preserved in negative. Scientists blamed wind patterns. Locals did not. They said the house had reappeared to protect its last inhabitant, the boy who could not die. That same year, a park ranger claimed to have seen a figure near the ruins during a full moon. He looked lost, the ranger said in an interview. But when I called out to him, he turned, and his eyes reflected light like an animal's. Then he was gone. Today, what remains of the Wainwright estate is swallowed by forest. But every few decades, when the fog grows thick and the moon is hidden, travelers still report a pale figure walking the old road. Some say he's searching for the woman who made him what he is. Others believe he's guarding her secret, the proof that life and death are not opposites, but mirrors, endlessly reflecting one another. And some whisper the darkest possibility of all, that he isn't guarding the secret anymore. He's looking for someone to pass it to. In the modern age, the story of the albino slave boy, the child no master wanted, should have disappeared into dust and superstition. Yet in ways no one could explain, it continued to surface, like something refusing burial. Every generation seemed to stumble upon fragments, a report here, a journal there, a photograph or recording that never quite made sense. The pattern was unmistakable and always the same. A pale figure seen under a moonless sky. Unnatural silence where sound should live. A feeling of being watched, not by one presence, but by memory itself. In 2003, a team of documentary filmmakers from Boston arrived in South Carolina to produce a series on American folklore. They were young, ambitious, armed with cameras and skepticism. The lead researcher, Lydia Vance, was a historian fascinated by the intersections between myth and trauma, how stories of ghosts often mask the wounds of the enslaved. She believed the tale of the moonborn boy was nothing more than a metaphor, a way for enslaved communities to explain the cruelty of isolation and deformity. Her goal was to prove it. The crew set up near the remnants of the old Wainwright estate, or where maps said it once stood. The air was unnaturally still. Birds avoided the trees and their instruments failed more than once. Batteries draining without warning, microphones picking up low hums that no one could identify. Lydia dismissed it as coincidence, but the locals who guided them were uneasy. "That place doesn't forget," one of them said quietly. "If you stay too long, it starts remembering you too." The first few nights yielded nothing unusual. They recorded interviews, filmed the terrain, and captured long, silent shots of the mist rolling across the marsh. But on the fourth night, as they reviewed the day's footage, one of the cameramen froze the frame. There, in the corner of a shot and behind a thicket of reeds, stood a figure, barely visible, motionless. Its skin shone pale even in infrared. When the camera panned back, it was gone. Lydia tried to rationalize it. Light reflection, lens flare, some animal caught at the right angle. But the next night it appeared again, closer this time. She went out with 2 assistants, determined to recreate the anomaly. They followed the same path along the marsh, their flashlights cutting through mist. For hours nothing. Then, without warning, their equipment flickered and went dark. The sound recorders emitted a faint rhythmic pulse. 3 beats, then silence. 3 beats again. Lydia thought it was a malfunction until she realized the pattern matched a heartbeat. Moments later, the mist thickened. A figure took form ahead, tall, thin, unmoving. It wasn't transparent like a ghost, but solid, almost painfully real. The others couldn't see his face clearly. but Lydia swore his eyes caught the light and reflected it like a mirror. "Who are you?" she called out. No answer. Only that slow, steady rhythm, like blood echoing inside the earth itself. Then, as quickly as he appeared, the figure turned and walked into the fog, dissolving with each step. The footage from that night became infamous. When they played it back, the sound distorted, a low voice whispering just beneath the static. "He remembers." Some believed it was a hoax, clever editing, nothing more. But the following morning, Lydia's notebook was found near the marsh. On the last page, written in hurried script, were 6 words. "He is not what she made." The documentary was never finished. The remaining team returned to Boston, and within months, 2 of them reportedly died in unrelated accidents. Lydia herself disappeared while traveling through Georgia the following year. Her belongings were found in a motel room, including her recorder, which captured her final words. "He's still there. But it's not him anymore." For years, conspiracy forums and dark history enthusiasts picked apart the story. Some claimed Silas was a ghost. Others thought he was an immortal, a cursed remnant of a forgotten experiment. But a few researchers went further. In 2012, an anthropologist studying genetic anomalies in African diaspora populations found something unsettling. A line of families in coastal South Carolina carried a recessive mutation linked to extreme melanin loss and abnormal cellular regeneration. Locals referred to it as the moon mark. According to oral history, the first child born with it was sold to a woman named Miriam Wainwright in the 1820s. The anthropologist's report was dismissed as pseudoscience by her peers, but private genetic databases later confirmed something stranger. Several samples in her study could not be matched to any known ancestry, human or otherwise. The data was sealed and her funding revoked. She left academia soon after, claiming she had been warned off by men who called themselves historical preservationists. Before vanishing from public life, she gave one interview saying, "He's not a ghost story. He's an echo of something humanity never should have touched." Meanwhile, the land itself seemed to resist change. Developers who tried to build near the Wainwright grounds complained of sinkholes, machinery failures, and workers who refused to stay after dark. In 2019, a drone photographer surveying the area for a conservation project captured a chilling image. A human figure standing in the fog, precisely where the old estate's foundation would have been. When zoomed in, the figure appeared expressionless, its skin faintly luminescent. Investigators found no footprints, no signs of entry, no human presence. Experts dismissed it as digital artifacting, but the locals had no doubt. They said Silas still wandered there, untouched by time, bound not to vengeance but to memory. Some said he was waiting, not for Miriam, not even for release, but for recognition, for someone to understand what had been done to him. And maybe that's the true darkness of the story, that he wasn't born cursed but made so by hands that sought to master life and death. The boy who once trembled before a whip had become something far worse than feared, a living reminder of the price of human cruelty disguised as science, and a soul forever trapped between the world that rejected him and the one that refused to let him go. Late one night, a truck driver crossing the old coastal road pulled over when he saw a boy walking barefoot along the edge of the fog. The driver slowed, calling out, asking if he needed help. The boy turned, and though the man swore he looked no older than 12, his eyes were ancient, calm, endless, and silvered by the reflection of the moon. "You shouldn't be here," the boy said softly. "The ground remembers." Then he stepped backward into the mist and was gone. The driver reported the incident, shaken, but by morning there were no footprints by the roadside, only frost, pure white, glittering under the first light of dawn. Over centuries, truth and myth blurred until no one could tell where the story ended. Was Silas real? Was he a curse? A remnant of lost science? Or simply the ghost of a child whom no one loved until it was too late? Perhaps he was all of them, a being created by the intersection of guilt and obsession. And so the tale endures, not because it's supernatural, but because it forces a question that still chills anyone who dares to ask it. What happens when humanity plays God and succeeds? If you've made it this far, then you already know this isn't just another forgotten story. It's a reflection of how silence shapes history, how the names we never learn, the voices we never hear, hold the real truth behind our past. The story of the albino slave boy isn't simply about cruelty or injustice. It's about how one life, unseen and unwanted, exposes the system that pretended to be human while feeding on its own darkness. If this story made you question what else has been buried beneath history's polite lies, then this channel is where you belong. Every week we uncover hidden truths, the stories too dark, too uncomfortable, or too dangerous for school books to ever mention. So, if you want more forbidden archives, more historical mysteries, more voices that were erased, then subscribe right now. Turn on the notifications so you never miss what they tried to make you forget. And tell me in the comments, what do you think really happened to him? Was his rescue genuine compassion, or another kind of ownership in disguise? I read every theory, every comment, because that's how history comes alive again. Join the community of those who still question. The past was never innocent, but together we can make sure it's never silent again. Subscribe, comment, and keep the truth alive.